In the autumn of 1944, an American bomber crew flying over Germany reported seeing something impossible. A silver aircraft appeared above their formation without warning. There was no propeller, no engine noise, no dogfight. It simply emerged from the clouds, closed the distance in seconds, fired a burst of cannon shells, tore a B-17 apart and disappeared before the escorting Mustangs could even begin to react. The entire attack lasted less than 30 seconds. For years, Allied fighter pilots had dominated the skies over Europe. German aircraft were becoming older, slower and fewer in number. Victory felt inevitable. Then the Me-262 arrived. It was nearly 100 miles per hour faster than every Allied fighter in existence. It climbed higher, it accelerated faster, it carried enough firepower to destroy a heavy bomber with a single burst. Pilots who had spent years mastering aerial combat suddenly found themselves chasing an airplane they physically could not catch. Some historians have called it the most advanced combat aircraft of the Second World War. Others have called it the greatest missed opportunity in military history. Because despite possessing a technological advantage, unlike anything the world had ever seen, Germany built fewer than 1,500 examples, fielded only a few hundred operationally, and introduced it far too late to change the outcome of the war. But many believe it didn't have to end that way. If one decision had been different, if one man had listened, if one aircraft had been used for the mission, it was actually designed to perform. The air war over Europe might have looked very different. This is the story of the world's first operational jet fighter, the aircraft that was decades ahead of its time, the machine that terrified Allied bomber crews, and the decision that turned Germany's greatest technological breakthrough into one of history's greatest military failures. The story begins long before the Second World War. In 1930, jet propulsion was little more than an engineer's dream. Aircraft had evolved rapidly during the First World War, but almost every airplane still relied on the same basic principle. A piston engine turned a propeller, pulling the aircraft through the sky. The faster engineers wanted to go, the larger the engine became. The larger the engine became, the heavier the aircraft became. Eventually, every designer ran into the same wall. Propellers lose efficiency as their tips approach the speed of sound. Add more horsepower and much of it simply disappears into noise, vibration and drag. The future required an entirely different solution. Across Europe, two young engineers arrived at almost exactly the same conclusion. One was a British Royal Air Force officer named Frank Whittle. The other was a German physics student named Hans von Ohain. Neither knew the other existed. Both believed aircraft should stop pulling themselves through the air. Instead, they should push themselves forward using continuous streams of high-speed exhaust gases. The concept became known as the turbojet. It sounded revolutionary. It also sounded impossible. Governments dismissed the idea as impractical. Aircraft manufacturers saw enormous costs with little chance of success. Most engineers simply continued improving piston engines. But von Ohain found someone willing to take the risk. His name was Ernst Heinkel. Unlike many industrialists, Heinkel had built his reputation by embracing unconventional technology. He believed aviation belonged to those willing to gamble before everyone else. In 1936, Heinkel hired the 25-year-old engineer and gave him a laboratory. Within a year, von Ohain had built Germany's first working jet engine. It produced only a few hundred pounds of thrust. It overheated constantly. It consumed enormous amounts of fuel. But it worked. On August 27, 1939, just days before Germany invaded Poland, the experimental Heinkel A178 lifted off from a runway near Rostock. It became the first jet-powered aircraft in history to fly successfully. The flight lasted only a few minutes. Almost nobody cared. The German Air Ministry attended demonstrations with little enthusiasm. Military planners saw no immediate need for expensive experimental aircraft when the Luftwaffe already possessed what appeared to be the finest fighter force on Earth. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 dominated European skies. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka terrified enemy armies. Blitzkrieg was rewriting modern warfare. Why spend fortunes developing engines that burned twice as much fuel and required entirely new manufacturing techniques? The future could wait. Ironically, that decision would give another company its opportunity. Messerschmitt. By 1938, Willy Messerschmitt had become Germany's most celebrated aircraft designer. His Bf-109 had transformed fighter aviation. Fast, lightweight and deadly, it became the backbone of the Luftwaffe. The company was producing thousands of aircraft each year. But Messerschmitt also understood something many German officials ignored. Piston engines were approaching their absolute limits. Even the best fighter in the world would eventually become obsolete. If Germany wanted to dominate the skies for another generation, someone had to build the next generation of aircraft before anyone else. In April 1939, the German Air Ministry finally issued a request, not for a production aircraft, not even for a prototype fighter, simply for research. Messerschmitt accepted immediately. The project received an unremarkable internal designation. Project 1065. At first, nobody expected it to become history's first operational jet fighter. The original design barely resembled the aircraft that would eventually terrify Allied bombers. Early engineers placed the engines inside the wing roots, believing that configuration would reduce drag. Wind tunnel testing revealed a serious problem. The engines generated enormous heat, creating structural complications that threatened the entire aircraft. The solution looked strange, but proved brilliant. Move both engines into separate pods beneath the wings. Maintenance became easier. Heat damage disappeared. If one engine failed, crews could replace it without dismantling the entire aircraft. The layout became so successful that nearly every modern jet airliner still follows the same basic arrangement today. But designing the airframe turned out to be the easy part. The engines became a nightmare. Germany possessed the world's most advanced jet concepts. It did not possess the materials needed to build reliable jet engines. A turbojet operates at temperatures far higher than any piston engine. The turbine blades rotate thousands of times every minute while enduring enormous heat and stress. Britain and the United States had access to larger supplies of heat-resistant alloys containing nickel, chromium and cobalt. Germany did not. Years of economic isolation and wartime shortages forced engineers to improvise. Instead of rare strategic metals, many components had to be manufactured from lower-grade steel. The consequences were severe. Engines wore out astonishingly fast. Turbine blades cracked. Bearings failed. Combustion chambers warped under heat. Some engines lasted fewer than 10 operating hours before requiring replacement. Others destroyed themselves during testing. Still, development continued, because despite every setback, every explosion, and every mechanical failure, one fact became impossible to ignore. Nothing else in the sky came close. During early taxi tests, engineers struggled to keep the aircraft on the runway because acceleration happened far faster than anyone expected. Test pilots described the sensation as unreal. Instead of the familiar vibration of piston engines, the aircraft surged forward with a smooth, relentless push, unlike anything aviation had experienced before. Then, on April 18, 1941, test pilot Fritz Wendell advanced both throttles. The experimental aircraft lifted into the air under pure jet power for the first time. History had entered the jet age. But while Germany had built the future, the war that future was supposed to win was already beginning to change. And soon, one man would make a decision that transformed the most advanced fighter in history into something it was never meant to be. By the summer of 1941, the Me-262 had proven something no aircraft ever had before. Jet propulsion worked. The future had arrived. But the aircraft that had just changed aviation still had one enormous problem. It could barely stay in the air. The sleek prototype looked revolutionary from the outside, yet hidden beneath its wings were engines that seemed determined to destroy themselves. Test flights were repeatedly interrupted by compressor stalls, turbine failures, and fires that forced pilots to shut down one engine, or sometimes both, before reaching the runway. Several prototypes crashed. Others spent months grounded while engineers searched for answers. Ironically, the airframe itself was outstanding. Test pilots praised its stability, its controls, and its astonishing speed. The weakness was never the airplane. It was the engines. The responsibility fell to Junkers, whose Jumo 004 turbojet would power the Me-262. Designing a jet engine was unlike anything engineers had attempted before. Every component operated under temperatures and stresses that conventional piston engines never experienced. Turbine blades glowed red hot. Bearings spun at extraordinary speeds. Tiny imperfections became catastrophic failures. Normally, engineers would solve these problems with exotic heat-resistant alloys. Germany no longer had that luxury. As the war expanded across Europe, strategic materials became increasingly scarce. Nickel, chromium, and cobalt were diverted toward other critical industries or cut off entirely by Allied blockades. The engineers at Junkers were forced to substitute inferior metals simply to keep development moving. The result was predictable. A brand new engine often required replacement after only 25 operating hours. Some failed much sooner. Pilots learned to move the throttles with extraordinary care. Advancing them too quickly could trigger compressor stalls. Reducing power too abruptly could flame out the engine completely. Flying the world's first jet fighter demanded a level of mechanical sympathy almost as important as flying skill. Yet despite every setback, the aircraft's potential became impossible to ignore. In test flights, the Me-262 consistently exceeded 500 miles per hour. No Allied fighter came close. The legendary Spitfire, the rugged P-47 Thunderbolt, the sleek P-51 Mustang. All were suddenly yesterday's technology. Even Germany's own Bf-109 and FW-190 seemed old-fashioned beside the silent surge of jet propulsion. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots returned from evaluation flights almost speechless. Many described the sensation the same way. It didn't feel like flying a faster airplane. It felt like flying into the future. By 1943, however, Germany's military situation had changed dramatically. The victories of Blitzkrieg were gone. The invasion of the Soviet Union had become a brutal war of attrition. In North Africa, Axis forces surrendered. Over Germany itself, a new threat appeared almost daily. American heavy bombers, hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators crossed the skies in broad daylight, escorted by ever-growing numbers of Allied fighters. Their targets were factories, railways, synthetic fuel plants, aircraft production lines, everything Germany needed to continue fighting. Entire cities disappeared beneath columns of smoke. Every month, the bombing intensified. German industry was being dismantled piece by piece. The Luftwaffe desperately needed something capable of stopping the bomber streams. The Me-262 seemed like the obvious answer. Its speed meant bombers could barely defend themselves before it was already gone. Its heavy armament made it devastating. Instead of the rifle-caliber machine guns carried by many earlier fighters, the Me-262 mounted 430mm Mk108 cannons concentrated in its nose. Each shell contained enough explosive power to rip apart a heavy bomber with only a handful of hits. One short burst could destroy an aircraft that normally absorbed hundreds of machine gun rounds. Everything pointed toward one conclusion. Germany had finally built the interceptor it desperately needed. Then Adolf Hitler visited the program. The meeting has become one of the most debated moments in aviation history. Hitler inspected the aircraft and immediately saw something different from his generals and engineers. He did not see a defensive interceptor. He saw an offensive weapon. By 1943, Allied armies were preparing for an invasion of Western Europe. Hitler believed Germany needed weapons capable of striking enemy forces before they landed. He envisioned the Mi-262 as a blitz bomber, a fast attack aircraft carrying bombs at speeds no Allied fighter could intercept. When officials explained that the aircraft had been designed as a fighter, Hitler reportedly became furious. According to multiple post-war accounts, he insisted the aircraft be converted into a bomber. The exact wording remains debated by historians. The consequences do not. The decision fundamentally altered the program. Instead of rushing the Mi-262 into combat as a high-speed interceptor, engineers now had to redesign portions of the aircraft to carry bombs beneath the nose. Bomb racks had to be added, sighting equipment modified, pilot training rewritten, production priorities shifted. Months disappeared. Some historians argue Hitler's role has been exaggerated and that technical delays alone prevented earlier deployment. Others believe the bomber requirement delayed operational service by several crucial months. Whatever the precise timeline, one fact is undeniable. Germany did not field the Mi-262 when it needed it most. While engineers debated configurations and factories struggled to produce engines, Allied bombers continued destroying the very factories building the jet. The irony bordered on tragedy. The aircraft designed to defend German industry could not be built because German industry was being destroyed. Every completed Mi-262 required specialized tooling, precision machining, and components manufactured across dozens of factories scattered throughout the Reich. The Allies understood this. As reconnaissance photographs identified new assembly plants, bombing missions followed. Production dispersed into forests, into tunnels, into abandoned mines. Assembly lines operated underground beneath mountains where workers labored around the clock under increasingly desperate conditions. Even then, shortages became overwhelming. Fuel disappeared. Experienced mechanics vanished into frontline combat units. Replacement pilots arrived with only a fraction of the training earlier Luftwaffe aviators had received. The aircraft entering service grew more advanced. The people operating them became less experienced. The imbalance widened every month. Yet every time the Mi-262 managed to fly against Allied aircraft, the results were startling. American escort pilots quickly realized something alarming. If a jet pilot chose not to fight, there was nothing they could do. The Mi-262 simply accelerated away. Mustangs attempting pursuit watched the distance grow larger instead of smaller. For the first time in the air war over Europe, Allied fighter pilots were no longer the fastest aircraft in the sky. But speed alone could not win Germany the war. The jet possessed weaknesses as well. The engines accelerated slowly, making rapid throttle changes dangerous. Takeoffs required long runways. Landings had to be flown carefully at relatively high speeds. During those vulnerable moments, the aircraft became surprisingly easy targets. Experienced Allied commanders noticed the pattern almost immediately. Instead of trying to chase jets in the air, they began waiting for them near their airfields. Mustangs circled above known Mi-262 bases, diving whenever a jet attempted to take off or return to land. The world's fastest fighter often died while flying slower than a trainer aircraft. Germany had created a machine unlike anything the Allies possessed. But by the time it reached operational squadrons, it was entering a battlefield where fuel was scarce. Factories were collapsing. Experienced pilots were disappearing, and the enemy controlled nearly every advantage except speed. The Mi-262 had become the most advanced fighter on Earth. Now it would have to prove that technology alone could overcome a war that Germany was already beginning to lose. And for a brief, terrifying moment, it almost did. In the autumn of 1944, the Me-262 finally entered combat. For years, it had existed as a promise, a glimpse of the future trapped inside an endless cycle of delays, redesigns, and mechanical failures. Now, it was real. The first operational jet fighter in history was about to face the largest air force the world had ever seen. The results were shocked both sides. American bomber crews had spent years defending themselves against piston-engine fighters. They understood the rhythm of an attack. Enemy aircraft approached from behind or above, closed the distance gradually, exchanged fire, and broke away. The Me-262 rewrote every rule. Bomber gunners often saw nothing until it was already firing. Closing at well over 500 miles per hour, the jet could slash through an entire bomber formation before defensive gunners had time to react. Its 4 Mk 108 30mm cannons unleashed an extraordinary volume of explosive fire. A single burst lasting barely 2 seconds could cripple or destroy a B-17 or B-24. Pilots described bombers simply coming apart. Wings folded, engines exploded, tails separated from fuselages. Entire aircraft vanished into clouds of smoke before escort fighters could even identify the attacker. For Allied air crews, it was unlike anything they had experienced. The psychological effect was enormous. For the first time since long-range escorts had secured air superiority over Germany, bomber crews once again felt vulnerable. Even the legendary P-51 Mustang, the finest piston-engine fighter of the war, could not intercept a Me-262 once it reached full speed. The jet dictated every engagement. It attacked when it wanted. It disengaged when it wanted. If the pilot avoided unnecessary manoeuvring, there was almost nothing an Allied fighter could do. The Luftwaffe knew exactly what it possessed. To maximise the aircraft's effectiveness, Germany concentrated its most experienced pilots into specialised jet units. The most famous became Jagdgeschwader 7, Fighter Wing 7, the world's first operational jet fighter wing. Leading many of these elite pilots was one of Germany's greatest fighter aces, Adolf Galland. Galland had flown throughout the Battle of Britain and become General of Fighters for the Luftwaffe. He repeatedly argued that the Me-262 should be employed exclusively as an interceptor against Allied bombers. His disagreements with Hitler became increasingly public. Eventually, he was removed from his command. But instead of disappearing from the war, Galland received permission to form an elite jet squadron, composed of Germany's finest surviving fighter pilots. The unit became known as Jagdverband 44. It was, in many ways, the Luftwaffe's final gamble. Among its ranks were some of the 100 scoring fighter aces in aviation history, men who had already claimed hundreds of aerial victories flying Bf-109s and FW-190s. Now they climbed into an aircraft decades ahead of anything they had flown before. Their combat reports bordered on disbelief. Many described Allied fighters appearing almost stationary as they accelerated past them. Others recalled destroying bombers before escort pilots even realized an attack had begun. The Me-262 gave exhausted Luftwaffe veterans something they had not possessed in years: hope. And yet, every victory came at an impossible cost. The aircraft remained brutally demanding to operate. Its engines required delicate throttle movements. Aggressive acceleration could destroy an engine before the pilot even reached combat altitude. Landing remained dangerous. Fuel shortages meant pilots often flew only a handful of training hours before facing experienced Allied veterans. Replacement engines arrived late, or not at all. Some aircraft sat grounded simply because there were no serviceable turbines available. Others lacked fuel. Others lacked pilots. Germany had created the world's most advanced fighter. It could no longer support it. Meanwhile, the Allies adapted with remarkable speed. Instead of wasting effort chasing jets through the sky, intelligence officers mapped every known MA-262 base. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed runways daily. Mustangs established patrols above likely approach paths. The moment a jet lowered its landing gear or began its takeoff roll, it became vulnerable. Many AME-262s were destroyed without ever reaching combat. Others were caught returning with nearly empty fuel tanks, unable to accelerate away. The jet dominated the air. The Allies dominated everything around it. Even so, the Me-262 continued proving what jet technology made possible. During the final months of the war, operational units claimed hundreds of Allied aircraft destroyed. Exact numbers remain debated, but historians generally credit Me-262 units with roughly 500 aerial victories. Those victories came despite overwhelming shortages, collapsing logistics, inexperienced pilots, constant bombing, and a war that Germany was clearly losing. The statistics reveal an extraordinary contradiction. Fewer than 1,500 Me-262s were built. Only around 300 ever became truly combat operational at any one time. Many never flew because they lacked engines. Others never left their airfields because there was no fuel. Yet this tiny force forced the Allies to rethink escort tactics, bomber formations, and airfield attacks during the closing months of the war. Imagine what thousands might have accomplished. It is one of military history's favourite questions. Could the Me-262 have changed the war if it had arrived earlier? On paper, the argument is compelling. Introduced in large numbers during 1943, the jet would have faced bomber formations with far fewer escort fighters. American strategic bombing might have suffered dramatically higher losses. Industrial targets could have remained operational longer. Germany might have delayed Allied air superiority by months, perhaps even longer. But wars are not won on paper. Every Me-262 still required scarce fuel Germany no longer possessed. Every engine still depended on strategic materials Germany could barely obtain. Every pilot still required months of training that the Luftwaffe could no longer provide. And every factory building, those aircraft remained vulnerable to Allied bombers that increasingly flew wherever they pleased. The Me-262 was not fighting in isolation. It was fighting inside an industrial war Germany was already losing. Its revolutionary technology could overcome enemy fighters. It could not overcome collapsing logistics, shattered production, and overwhelming Allied manufacturing power. The world's first jet fighter had proven beyond any doubt that the future belonged to jet aviation. But whether it had arrived too late, or whether one decision had doomed it from the very beginning, remains one of the most fiercely debated questions of the Second World War. And the answer lies not in what the Me-262 became, but in what Germany had already lost long before the first jet ever entered combat. So, could the Me-262 have won the war? It is one of the most enduring questions in military history. The aircraft was unquestionably revolutionary. It was the fastest operational fighter of the Second World War. It introduced jet propulsion to aerial combat. It forced every Allied air force to rethink interception tactics almost overnight. And after the war, its influence reached far beyond Germany. When American, British, and Soviet forces captured German airfields in 1945, they found more than abandoned aircraft. They found the future. Engineers from every major Allied nation dismantled Me-262s piece by piece. They studied the swept-wing research, the engine layouts, the manufacturing techniques, and the operational lessons learned under combat conditions. The jet age that defined the second half of the 20th century did not begin in Korea or Vietnam. It began on the runways of wartime Germany. Aircraft like the American F-86 Sabre and the Soviet MiG-15 owed part of their development to research, accelerated by the Me-262. Even modern jet fighters still follow principles first proven by Messerschmitt's engineers more than 80 years ago. In technological terms, the Me-262 succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. In military terms, the story is far more complicated. The popular version of history often places the blame on a single decision. Hitler insisted that the Me-262 become a bomber. The fighter was delayed. Germany lost the air war. Simple. It is an explanation that fits neatly into a headline. Reality rarely does. There is little doubt that Hitler's insistence on using the aircraft as a fast bomber complicated the program. Engineers were forced to divide their attention. Production priorities shifted. Valuable time was lost during the most critical phase of development. But historians today generally agree that this was only one piece of a much larger disaster. Even without the bomber requirement, the Me-262 still faced enormous obstacles. The engines remained dangerously unreliable. Many lasted only 20 to 25 flight hours before replacement. Germany lacked the rare metals needed to improve them. Factories producing engines and airframes were bombed relentlessly. Rail networks carrying components were collapsing. Fuel shortages became catastrophic. By early 1945, some Luftwaffe pilots had enough fuel for only a single combat sortie before waiting days for another opportunity to fly. An advanced fighter means little if it cannot leave the runway. Pilot quality had also deteriorated dramatically. Early in the war, Germany trained some of the finest aviators in the world. By 1945, many replacement pilots entered combat with only a fraction of that experience. Flying the Me-262 demanded precision. A careless throttle movement could destroy an engine. A rushed landing could destroy the aircraft. It was a machine designed for highly trained professionals at a time when Germany could no longer produce enough of them. Then there was the overwhelming industrial imbalance. During the war, Germany built roughly 1,400 Me-262s. The United States alone produced nearly 13,000 P-51 Mustangs. More than 12,000 B-17 Flying Fortresses. Almost 19,000 B-24 Liberators. Thousands of P-47 Thunderbolts. Thousands more aircraft rolled off assembly lines every month. Germany was attempting to introduce a revolutionary weapon while fighting opponents capable of replacing entire air fleets faster than Germany could replace engines. Technology could win battles. It could not overcome production on that scale. The Me-262 was not defeated because it was inferior. It was defeated because it belonged to a nation that had already lost the economic war. Even if every technical problem had been solved, even if Hitler had approved it immediately as a fighter, even if production had begun several months earlier, Germany still faced overwhelming shortages of fuel, trained pilots, aluminum, transportation and manufacturing capacity. The Me-262 could have increased Allied losses significantly. It might have delayed parts of the bombing campaign. It almost certainly would have made the air war far more costly. But most historians believe it could not have reversed the outcome of the conflict on its own. Its greatest victory was not saving Germany. It was changing aviation forever. Every generation of fighter aircraft that followed inherited lessons first learned by the Me-262. Jet propulsion replaced piston engines. Heavy cannon armament became standard for interceptors. High-speed aerodynamics became the new battlefield. Within a decade of the war's end, propeller-driven fighters had largely disappeared from frontline service. The Me-262 had shown the world where aviation was going. There was no going back. Perhaps that is the greatest irony of all. The aircraft arrived too late to save the nation that created it, but just early enough to reshape every nation that defeated it. Its pilots fought with extraordinary courage in impossible circumstances. Its engineers achieved what many believed impossible only a few years earlier. Its technology survived long after the regime that built it collapsed into history. Today, restored Me-262s fly only on rare occasions, their distinctive engines producing a sound unlike any piston aircraft that came before them. It is the sound of the moment aviation crossed a line from one era into another. The Me-262 did not lose because it was flawed. It lost because revolutionary technology cannot compensate for failing strategy, collapsing industry, and a war that has already slipped beyond recovery. In the end, the world's first jet fighter wasn't defeated by the P-51 Mustang. It wasn't defeated by the Spitfire. It wasn't even defeated by Allied bombers. It was defeated by time. Time lost to development. Time lost to politics. Time lost to strategic mistakes that no engineering breakthrough could ever recover. And that may be the real lesson of the Me-262. History is full of inventions that were ahead of their time. Very few arrived at exactly the wrong moment. The Me-262 was one of them. It changed the future, but it could no longer change the present. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more deep dives into the aircraft, engineering, and pivotal decisions that shaped the Second World War, make sure to subscribe. And if there's another legendary aircraft you'd like us to cover next, let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.